Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is philosopher of science and author Lee McIntyre. Lee McIntyre, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much for having me.
I have a brief bio on you, and then we shall get started. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He holds a BA from Wesleyan University and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. He has taught philosophy at Colgate University, Boston University, Tufts Experimental College, Simmons College, and Harvard Extension School, where he received the Dean's Letter of Commendation for distinguished teaching. Formerly executive director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University, he has also served as a policy advisor to the executive dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. He is the author of several books, including How to Talk to a Science Denier, The Scientific Attitude, Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience, and Post Truth. Lee McIntyre's popular essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Nature, Newsweek, Scientific American, and numerous other venues. He has appeared on CNN International, PBS, NPR, the BBC, and has spoken at the United Nations, NASA, and the Vatican, and his work has been translated into 17 languages. His newest book, soon to be out in August, is titled On Disinformation, How to Fight for Truth and Protect Democracy. Professor McIntyre, Dr. McIntyre, Lee McIntyre, what do you prefer?
You can call me Lee. It's just fine with me.
All right, Lee, thank you so much for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. I did reach out to you initially to talk about your book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. But of course, I've read much of your other writing, and you are a philosopher of science. So this conversation will undoubtedly draw from several areas of your research and writing. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Whatever you want to talk about, I'm game.
With that in mind, before we talk about how to talk to a science denier, I just want to get your thoughts on a few things, some definitions before we move forward. And then later on, if I ask a question or I seem forgetful about something, just go ahead and say, remember, I defined that as this.
Okay.
And if you need to...
Right. Sure.
Okay. So
philosophers are good at doing that. It's all right.
Good. And I don't mind if you say that, because it's not really corrective. I don't mind being corrective either, but it's definitive. It helps lay the groundwork.
Sure.
I know you're not supposed to ask more than one question at once, but I think in this case it's appropriate. So I want to ask you first, what is science? Who does it? And what does it mean to do science?
And so that's three questions, and that's a big question. So I wrote a book called The Scientific Attitude, where I sort of define what I think is science and the appropriate way to do it, which is to say it's not prescriptive because scientists already know how to do it, but I'm explaining for the lay public what I think is really special about science. And what I think is most special about science is that scientists as a community care about facts, they care about evidence, and they're willing to change their mind when the evidence changes. And that is just kind of the bumper sticker version of what I think is the greatest form of human reasoning, because we are comparing what we think is true, maybe what we hope is true, against what actually is true. Understanding that we can never get there perfectly, understanding that proof and certainty are not in the game for this type of reasoning. But we're holding ourselves to account by constantly comparing what we think is true against reality. People who do it are people who can live with that ethos, the people who are curious about nature, who don't just say, well, this is what I believe, take it or leave it, but who have the flexibility of mind and the humility to be able to say, I was wrong, and to change their mind. And now, Brian, I forget the third part of your question. What is science? Who does it? And what was the other part?
And what does it mean to do science? But I think you kind of covered that when I asked, what is science?
Oh, yeah, but you got to give me a shot there, because what it means to do science is to hold us accountable, not just the scientists, but everyone. So that because scientists are looked to for their particular knowledge, and can do miraculous things with technology and even inventing vaccines during an epidemic and save lives. So it's a pretty incredible thing.
How does science work? I'm not a scientist.
I'm not either.
Okay. But you are a philosopher of science.
I am.
And so what we're taught in grade school is the scientific method. All right. But I know from your perspective, there are some problems with that. So, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm setting it up there. So how does science work, and is it a method, I guess?
It's funny because almost the first thing that anybody is taught in school about how science works, not the result of science, but how science works, is scientific method. And I remember this when I was in elementary school, kind of the 5-step method. You observe, you form a hypothesis, you test, whatever your hypothesis is against the evidence, and then you gather the result, you revise it, and then you go back to the beginning. And that's not a bad rubric, for some of the pieces of what scientists do as a procedure. But the beef that I have, and that a lot of philosophers of science have against scientific method per se, is that it sounds like a recipe. That, if you just start at the beginning, you get truth at the other end. And that's not really how it works. And that's not really what I think is most distinctive about science. The most famous philosopher of science who ever lived, Karl Popper, has an essay called "Why There Is No Scientific Method." So I think if folks want to read about that, they can read it there. And I've said a little bit about that myself in my book, Scientific Attitude. So I'd like to get people to stop referring to the scientific method and start referring to the scientific attitude. Because what I think is really distinctive about science is not some recipe that they follow in their reasoning, some checklist, as if you could go like you were getting ready to fly a plane, and you have to go down the checklist and check it off. Although flying a plane is much harder than that. It's that you need to have the proper mindset to do science. You need to be willing to change your mind when the evidence tells you to change. And I want to emphasize that that's a community property. That's not, scientific method makes it sound like, well, anybody can do it individually. But the scientific attitude, yes, you can have that idea in your own mind, but it's really this. Your colleagues are going to check up on you. Sometimes that testing in scientific method isn't done by you, it's done by other people. And that's where the scientific attitude comes in, because I like to say that scientists keep one another honest, even if they were honest in the first place. It's a way to make sure that you're not just saying what you think or hope is true, but what's actually true.
Let me ask a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
From the public perspective, I wonder if we've been a little bit misled about science then.
Yeah.
Because what you're leading into is the practice of science different than the way it's reported? And I'm kind of thinking here, if I read a 10-page paper, I can reflect on it and say, I don't know, it took years, or it took a long time to gather the data. They had to analyze the data. The paper is submitted, it's reviewed, sent back for revision. It's accepted for publication months after the original submission, maybe years after the data collection. So there's a lot going on there, it sounds like, that gets boiled down into 10 pages or so that follows a method, IMRED, introduction, methods, results, conclusion.
Right.
Has the public come to, well, I don't know if misled's the wrong word, but do you see where I'm going here? That it's like we get this.
I do, but the distinction I want to draw is the distinction between science and science education. Because I'll take my own education as an example. When I was in elementary school, I was not taught science. I was taught science appreciation. I was taught the results of, Mendel and Newton. I'm not even sure we got to that in elementary school.
We never
My
got to
point
Newton.
is this: we were taught to think that scientists were geniuses who discovered truth. And weren't we the lucky people who lived in the age in which all truth had already been discovered, so that we could just see what the geniuses had said, memorize it, and then we would know the truth? Well, that is not the scientific attitude. So they were not training us to be scientists. They were training us to worship scientists. And I think it would have been much better if they had taught us about the accidents, the mistakes, the humility, the uncertainty. I mean, at the core of science is uncertainty. And I think we are misled to a certain extent. And this is why I have such frustrating conversations sometimes with science deniers, because they are misled into thinking that science is about proof and certainty. And so sometimes when I'm trying to talk to them about their denialist beliefs, I'll say, what could change your mind, right? Because I'm trying to introduce them to that idea of scientific attitude. What evidence could change your mind? And sometimes they'll say proof, to which my response is, wait a minute, science isn't about proof. Who taught you that science was about proof? I mean, Euclid is about proof. Deductive logic is about proof. Science is not about proof. It's about probability based on the evidence. But no matter how much evidence you get in favor of your hypothesis, you can't know that it's true. Though if you get evidence against it, then you need to revise and start again. And that usually comes as something of a revelation. I mean, all of these people, whether they trust science or not, really don't understand how scientists think. And I would like them to start in the elementary school teaching how scientists think by not pretending that they already know the answers. One of the best science classes I ever had was, I believe it was ninth grade in high school. I went to a much better high school, and it was the unknowns lab in chemistry. And they gave us 7 vials full of things, and we had to perform tests to figure out what was in there. And it was wonderful because we didn't know the answer, and we had to think like a scientist to find it.
Pulling on your philosophy of science and the public, are there limits to science?
Sure. Science can't tell you anything about a topic for which there's no evidence. If there's no empirical evidence, it can't answer that question. Science cannot tell you what happens after you die. There's no evidence on that. Science cannot tell you what happens on a planet we can't see, that's too far outside, that we'll never receive the light in time to analyze it before the world blows up. That it's all speculative, right? So I mean, there are definitely limits. Science, I don't think, though this is a point of contention in philosophy, I don't think that science can tell you about human values. I think that human values are beyond the reach of empirical data. There may be other systematic ways to study it, but I don't think you can have a science of ethics. Now, again, people would disagree about that. So I think there are many things that are beyond the reach of science.
Looking into the scientist or the science attitude, as you've described it here, it's still done by people, right? It's humans that are involved.
Yes.
And the point is to find out the nature of the world. But as it's done by humans, and even though it's a consensus, what I mean is you have to justify your work to your peers and they are able to respond and go back and forth. Is science objective, neutral, value-free?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and it doesn't have to be. One of the best things that I ever read on this was the work of Helen Longino, philosopher out in Stanford. And I consider her to be quite intellectually honest, because she said at the beginning of one of her books that she set out to prove how objective science was. And at the end of it, she figured out that it really couldn't be. Now, of course, now we're going to get into all the definitions. What does it mean to be objective? What does it mean to be value-free? Let me put it this way. I think that having another set of eyes on a hypothesis. So I come up with a hypothesis, but then you and all of my other colleagues look at it to try to pick it apart, to try to see if there's something wrong with it. I think that's as good as we can get, right? Because then you're asking if my hypothesis is wrong, which, knowing how that feels, I'm going to ask before I even show it to you whether my own hypothesis is wrong. So I mean, that's a kind of objectivity, but I don't think I mean, this idea that science has to be completely neutral, completely value-free, completely objective in order to do it, it really can't be because it's practiced by human beings. And really, would you want it to be? I mean, would you want a physician who didn't care, didn't think that life was better than death, or didn't think that health was better than disease? No, I mean, that's medicine is normative, that yes, we like life, we like health. And that's all right. You can still have a science when you're not completely objective.
All right, I'm not sure about this next question. I'm going to throw it out there. It's leading into
Sure.
this will lead directly into your book here. So you've talked about the science attitude, the way it works as a group, your hypotheses showing other people, you're not proving something correct, and so on. Should we trust scientists? So science consensus cares about evidence and will change, as you've written, but not always true for individual scientists, right? Like,
Yes.
I'm thinking specifically in recent history, we've got Didier Raoult, this great Barrington Declaration people, Michael Hollick, vitamin D fame, even Linus Pauling, Nobel Prize winning, went off on a vitamin C tangent and disparaged people that disagreed with him.
Yeah.
So take that question any way you want.
Newton worked for years on alchemy. I mean, this goes way back. I think that scientists earn trust to the extent that they are calibrating what they say against the evidence. How likely is it given the evidence? Scientists are human beings. They can make mistakes. Now, mistakes are not the most terrible thing that ever happened because you can learn from mistakes. In fact, you could make a good argument that that's how science learns. There's a terrific book called Failure that that talks about, makes the case that's how scientists learn. Okay, the real problem is fraud. Okay, so when people ask the question, "Can you trust scientists?" I think for some people, and this comes up with deniers a lot, they think that scientists are lying to them. They think that scientists are committing fraud, pretending to know something when they don't for whatever nefarious purpose. And that is quite the charge. I mean, somebody once said that there are no heretics in science. Well, as close as you get to heresy is fraud, right? Because to claim that something is true when you fudge the data, when you're pulling the wool over the eyes of your colleagues, that's just not allowed. I mean, you're basically kicked out of the profession at that point. And the reason is because it's hard enough to do science. It's hard enough to build on somebody else's work. I mean, you might spend your entire career building on somebody else's work. And then if you find out that work was fraudulent, what a waste. So I think that people should trust scientists. But what's that phrase that Reagan liked to use from the Russian, trust but verify, right? It's okay to trust a scientist, but then to get fascinated and want to check the data yourself. And scientists do this all the time in peer review. I mean, it's part of science. What is really a bad conclusion, though, from this idea that you need to check is this idea that sometimes lay people have that they know just as much as the scientists, that they need to do their own research because the scientists are corrupt and can't be trusted, and they're able to, really discern with no special training what the answer is. That's laughable that people would think that. Now, people get upset about things like vaccines, where maybe their physician is patronizing to them because they've got questions about vaccines. They don't know the answer. So they might get angry and want to do their own research, and that's fine. I mean, I sometimes go to Google with a medical question. But you should apply the same level of skepticism and more skepticism to answers that you find on Google, to things that seem true, but you don't really have any evidence that they're true, or worse, the things that you want to be true. Because even if we're not scientists, I think we could benefit from the scientific attitude.
All right, let's specifically move that right into your book. Okay.
Okay.
I introduced your book as How to Talk to a Science Denier. I specifically left out the subtitle, and I want to state that now. So it's How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. Some people might read that subtitle and just think, those aren't all equivalent. Everyone knows the Earth is a sphere, but climate change, that's different. That seems a little sketchy to me. Or people might say, everyone knows the Earth is a sphere and climate change is happening, but vaccines, I don't know about that. There's a lot of stuff in vaccines, especially that mRNA one. So what makes those views similar, or what binds them together? And that I'm talking about flat earther, which seems extreme, to climate change, to vaccines.
It's interesting that this is not work that I did. This is work prior to mine by Mark and Chris Hoofnagel. And it was later developed by Stephen Lewandowski and John Cook. And what they found is that there is a common blueprint of reasoning amongst all science deniers: flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, evolution deniers, climate deniers. All of them reason in exactly the same way. They all cherry pick evidence. They believe in conspiracy theories. They engage in illogical reasoning. They rely on fake experts, and they think that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. Those 5 steps you will always find in science denier reasoning. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that somebody who's a denier about one thing is necessarily a denier about another. I call science deniers cafeteria skeptics. They go through the cafeteria line and say, "Ooh, I'll take a little bit of this, and I'll take a little bit of that. Oh, I don't like this, I don't like that." So some people have characterized science deniers as anti-science. I've never met anybody who was anti-science, somebody who didn't believe any science or thought that science was a sham. I mean, maybe the Unabomber, right? But I mean, not that I met him, but I mean, that's the only person I can think of who's just anti-science. Instead, science deniers tend to be very trusting of science about certain things, but they're not trustworthy of science. They don't trust science about other things. And here's a revelation. They don't trust science about the things on which they're radicalized not to believe it. Science denial is usually a function of disinformation. Somebody has told them scientists are lying about evolution, or you can't trust the vaccines, or, don't you know that the California wildfires were started by a Jewish space laser? Somebody made all that stuff up, and then science deniers are made. And so it's no wonder that they're made on specific topics, because those are the topics on which the people who are lying to them have special interests. The fossil fuel companies don't want it to be true that climate change is real. The tobacco companies didn't want it to be true that smoking caused lung cancer. So they created a denialist campaign to try to pull the wool over everybody's eyes.
You sort of answered this. I was going to ask the question, how do you define a science denier? And it seems like they can compartmentalize from what you just said, so that they can accept many facets of science, like they have a cell phone, they make use of transportation. Nobody's foraging for wild plants yet. We eat modern agriculture. So it doesn't seem like my question, how do you define it? It seems like it could. It's
a good question, and I've got 2 German shepherds in here with me, and one of them's having a dream, so you're going to hear a little bit of yipping because
that's okay.
Chasing a rabbit down the rabbit hole. Say what we're doing. Okay, so I define a science denier this way. A science denier is somebody who denies the scientific consensus, and because it's not enough just to say they deny the scientific consensus, because sometimes scientists do that. They deny the scientific consensus, and they don't have any evidence for their alternative belief. And this is a big one. They're not willing to say what evidence you could offer to change their mind.
Wait, step through those 3 again, one more time, please.
They don't believe the scientific consensus on some particular topic. They don't have any evidence for their own alternative belief about why the consensus is wrong. And the most important step, they cannot tell you what evidence you could offer to change their mind. That last piece is absolutely crucial, because that last piece means they don't have the scientific attitude. When I was talking to flat earthers, one once said to me, well, you're saying I'm denying the consensus, so I'm a denier. I said, no, people deny the scientific consensus all the time. I would ask them, what evidence could I offer to prove that you were wrong? And they would say proof or certainty. Well, but that's not what science is about. And then we'd have a conversation about that. So if somebody cannot, a scientist can always tell you, if you could show me X, Y, Z, I would change my mind. That's the mark of science. If you can't do that, you're not a scientist.
Is there any correlation between level of education and changing one's mind due to facts?
I have met scientists who are science deniers on certain topics. So level of education, I mean, people, just because you have expertise in one topic doesn't mean you're an expert on all topics. So, if somebody's a great physicist, it doesn't mean they understand, weather patterns necessarily, right? They might. So it is possible for somebody to be a denier despite even specialized training. It is, and that's because denial is not a function of education. It's a function of identity. It's a function of other things that go into shaping beliefs, which we can talk about a little bit if you like, but it's shocking. In fact, there's some empirical evidence to show that sometimes the most virulent science deniers are the best educated because they know how to push back. They know, they know how to defend themselves in argument. It's very frustrating.
And I asked that question, it's a similar question to questions I ask other authors and people that I have that are skeptics and have done work in this field, is that I don't like to use the word gullible. I think susceptible is a better word, but myself included, I think we're all susceptible. So I hate it when people think, oh, that could never happen to me. It depends on
they're wrong.
Right, it depends on the circumstances. So people watching this conversation, I don't want them to think, oh, flat earthers, those dopes, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
it doesn't really
right.
work like that. So why did you write this book specifically, How to Talk to Science Deniers? Where did this come from?
Because I'm very worried about climate change. And I want to know how to change climate deniers' minds in time to save the planet. And then once I read that work by the Hufnagel brothers, I realized something. Wait a minute. If they're right, it means that that the flat earthers and the climate deniers are reasoning in the same way. Now, if you've ever talked to a climate denier, it's very difficult because it gets technical immediately. Because, especially if they're educated, they have read things that maybe you haven't read, or maybe they've got a different interpretation of it. I mean, they've usually got 20 things that unless you can, with what you've got in your pocket, tell them why they're wrong, they're not going to change their mind, and they probably wouldn't even then. So I wanted to practice up. I wanted to practice up on the flat earthers because I thought, well, they'll be easy. Well, they were not easy. But were they following the same type of reasoning? Yes, they were. And so my goal, notice that the title of the book is How to Talk to a Science Denier, not How to Convince Them. Okay, though talking is a prelude to convincing someone. I understood that you have to gain somebody's trust. The science deniers don't have a fact deficit, they have a trust deficit. They've been radicalized not to believe people on the other side. And so if you just go in there with facts blazing or insulting them, you're never going to get anywhere. So you have to be calm and patient. You have to listen quite a bit. I spent the whole first day at the Flat Earth Convention just listening, kind of incognito. I didn't lie to anybody, but I didn't say much. I wanted to hear what they had to say. And so I wrote that book because I wanted to learn how to talk to people who had different views than I did, because I became convinced that was the only way to convert them. Now, I've since learned a few things about whether that's enough to solve the problem, and I don't think it is, which is why I'm writing about new things now. But I do think that once somebody's already infected with the disinformation, once they already believe the lie that that Fauci can't be trusted, or that the somebody's poisoning our water, all these other things, then you have to do the remediation work. You have to do the salvage work of trying to bring them back from that.
Back to climate denial, flat earthers, and vaccine denials. Yeah. And they are different, but they have those three. They reject consensus. They don't have evidence of their own belief. And they couldn't tell you what would indicate that they're wrong.
That's right.
So does denial beget denial, though? I mean, if you deny one thing, are you likely to deny another? Yes. Like, and here I think like the complementary medicine people, they'll believe like there's one true cause of all disease that they can cure, but also they will not hesitate to recommend their other alternative friends, if that makes any sense.
If it were a ranking, and then there was this kind of slippery slope, then maybe so. I mean, look, if somebody's a conspiracy theorist, they're very likely to believe more than one conspiracy theory. And since all science deniers are conspiracy theorists, I guess, technically the answer is yes, they're more likely in that sense. Yet I've met many science deniers who are deniers about a particular topic and not others. The best example is flat Earth. You've got, how many climate deniers are flat earthers? Not very many. How many anti-vaxxers are flat earthers? Not very many. And in fact, they're insulted. If you were to say to them, do you know your reasoning exactly like a flat earther does? They would get furious at you. Likewise, the flat earthers, most of them that I met were not climate deniers. Now, their reason for not being climate deniers was fascinating. It's because they think that the earth is flat, that the Antarctica is a mountain range around the perimeter of the earth to keep the water from falling off, and there's a dome over the top. So we live in a terrarium, which is why we've never been to the moon, because the spaceship can't get outside. But they're not climate deniers because they think we live in a terrarium. And if you think you live in a terrarium, you have to be very careful of what's underneath the surface of that crystalline sphere. So that is a ridiculous reason. Yet, to their credit, most of them that I met were not climate deniers. I know it's odd. No, take a second to wrap your head around what I just said, right? But I mean, they do pick and choose.
I can understand why a flat earther could accept climate change, but how do they justify it? In other words, is our pet owner turning up the light bulb too much on the terrarium? I mean, what is causing it?
I didn't get into that. I didn't get into that with them. No.
All right. And I still want to go back just a little bit because I know people thinking, oh, these dopes that live in their parents' basements or what. I want to get out of that frame of mind. I just want to quell that again. Beyond those three, are there other factors that need to be in place to become a denialist, such as, if you're a MMR vaccine denier, you're likely to be one political demographic. If you're a flat earther, you're more likely to be male, or whatever denial, you're more likely to be a Christian, Jewish, or something. Anything that correlates at all.
You do find certain demographic correlations. It's hard to tell whether they are cause or effect, or whether they were exploited later. I mean, anti-vax started off when it was before COVID. Anti-vax used to be pretty nonpartisan. I mean, you had people in the radical left and the radical right who were anti-vaxxers. Now, for different reasons, some of them didn't trust big pharma, some of them didn't trust big government, or both, right? But what happens is that sometimes areas of disagreement, prior areas of disagreement about factual matters are exploited politically for people's political ends. And so climate change was exploited. It was politicized. The COVID the pandemic was exploited. It was politicized. So do you find more science denial on the right? Yes, you do. That doesn't necessarily mean that science denial is only a problem from the right, or there's no such thing as left-wing science denial. And I looked in doing research for my book, for examples of this, not in a way to try to make everything even, because it's not even, but just to show what I think you were getting at with this question. This is everybody's problem. This is not just a problem where you can say, well, I'm not an X, so I don't have to worry about this, right? I've been educated, or, I'm a Christian, or I'm not a Christian, or I'm not that kind of Christian, right? Or I'm an independent, I'm not a liberal, I'm not a conservative, whatever. If you think you can identify some factor that makes you immune, you're mistaken. Because, you can actually find denial about different topics. I'll tell you here uh, a story that I probably shouldn't tell on TV, because it's a story about myself. I was sitting there writing this book called How to Talk to a Science Denier, sitting at my desk all day, every day, and I'd just gotten a new 5G router. And I started to read some things and get a little worried about it. And I didn't have time because I was writing this book. So I didn't have time to really chase this down to the end of the earth. And I thought, well, just be on the safe side. I'll just buy a little. I saw on a Facebook ad one day this little kind of a sleeve that you could put over your router. And since my router had a cable, I didn't have to worry about Wi-Fi. So I just put it over. And it was a Faraday cage is what it was. And then my wife would get home from work and say, the Wi-Fi is out. I say, no, I've just got this, cover on it. And then as this bubbled up into my consciousness a little bit more, I realized that's ridiculous. The things that I was reading about 5G that kind of sounded like maybe they were true were the result of a conspiracy theory. And so I eventually took the sleeve off my router, but I keep it to remind me anybody can fall for this stuff.
Well, actually, that is a good story. So, and
Except I'll get mail about it. No, but that's okay.
But it's a way, but you work through it.
I did.
Right. That's the important thing. When you go back to, you had some reason to believe it, you thought, and you did the research, and not on your own. You're also a philosopher of science, so you kind of do know how things work. Maybe, you're keen to what to look for. But
I didn't go to Google and ask, is 5G dangerous?
Oh.
Because then the first 20 hits would have just reinforced the idea that it was dangerous. And then I go to YouTube, and by then I'm going to a 5G convention and wearing the t-shirt, right? No, so I was a little more careful than that.
So setting aside commonalities between what makes a science denier, when you spoke with at the Flat Earth or other people, did you ask about what they do believe? I'm wondering if there are common threads to what they do believe and how they accept evidence.
I noticed as a demographic fact at the Flat Earth International Convention, FEIC, that's the one I went to. There's also the Flat Earth Society. They're blood enemies. So, yeah, okay. So I'm speaking, so I went to see the FEIC. At that convention, about 70% of them were evangelical Christians. Now, they did not believe Flat Earth on the basis of their faith, so they said. So, I would say, is this a faith-based belief? Absolutely not. We think we have the evidence for this, and we have the evidence why you're wrong. Okay, well, I can have that debate, right? Because if it had been a matter of faith, then there's really nothing more to talk about because it's not a scientific question. But they thought that they were scientists, okay? And then we can have a question. What is science? What's your evidence? What evidence could prove you wrong? Et cetera, right? So, but I kept that in the back of my head, though. Why were so many of them evangelical Christians? And I asked one fellow in particular, I remember a good conversation with him where I said, so, and by the way, most evangelical Christians are not flat earthers. So I asked him, but he was both. And he said he thought of it this way, that he wasn't a flat earther because he was a Christian, but that flat earth certainly made sense of Noah's flood. That answered a question that he would have had otherwise. So there was a kind of reconciling of belief for some people, though several of the speakers at the convention were completely secular, and said, I am an atheist, completely secular, but I think flat earth is a thing. So I didn't find any, necessary condition. I did find one 100% correlation, though, that would be interesting to you. They all were converted on YouTube.
No way.
That's what happened. They all used to be globalists. and were converted on YouTube. Every person that I spoke to about 25 or 30 people. Every person that I spoke to was converted based on YouTube videos. And a lot of their evidence that they offered at the convention were YouTube videos. And, in these, they go, oh, yes, and have you seen this one? Have you seen that one? So YouTube was the gateway for flat Earth. And I wonder whether that's also the case then for other types of science denial.
So 25 or 30 people out of 650, it's kind of a small sample size. You can still get good results from a small sample if it's done well. It'd be an interesting survey or questionnaire to try and get people to take.
It really would. It really would.
Wow.
I mean, it was 100% based on look, when they do a political survey of, 300 million Americans, what do they interview? 2,800 people. I mean, I don't know what the statistics tell you about how many of 650 you have to interview to get a representative sample, but I felt like I talked to a lot of people, and I kept hearing the same story over and over.
Let me ask you what seems to be an odd question. All right, I'm going to put myself out there. And this comes back to your question about belief, nature of belief that you alluded to before. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a corollary to denier. All right. Personally speaking, I don't know that the Earth is round. I don't know there isn't a wall of ice that keeps the sea contained on a disk.
That's right.
I've read the history of inoculation, from dried pus to the skin scratch method to Edward Jenner and vaccines. Well, I don't know anything about the germ theory of disease, right? I read a lot of epidemiology papers on this and that. I accept many of the findings, but I didn't do the work, right? So I know something second, third hand, and I think I've learned something. But it's because I trust the research team did a good work and they represented it accurately. But beyond that, sometimes I don't have time to read a paper and trust the research team. I find someone else that's done a synopsis, and I trust them and I read them. All right. I recognize that they have the ability and the knowledge to explain it to me. So I'm not taking it on authority. I already recognize their expertise. Yeah. All right. So does that make me an acceptor, the opposite of a denier? And if so, isn't that also flawed?
I love that question. That's a good question. No, I don't think it makes you an acceptor, because if you've got some sort of a process by which you're vetting who you can, it's because it's about trust, and you're vetting who you can trust and who you can't. And there's some sense in which I think that the whole denial, non-denial question is a question of trust, and putting trust in the wrong people. Remember, the fourth step in the science denial reasoning is a reliance on fake experts. Well, how do they find those fake experts? How do they decide that those are the experts they're going to trust, but they're not going to trust the other ones? Sometimes it's because they're saying things that they want to believe is true. Sometimes it's that they're saying things that other people have already told them are true, or that the people in their community think are true. A lot of belief, even belief about empirical topics, is communal. You tend to believe what the people around you believe. So here's a kind of a really bake your noodle question, a follow-up on what you just said. Do you trust scientists mostly because the other people around you trust scientists? And if the other people around you didn't trust the scientists, would you be more skeptical of them? Because I'm the same as you, right? I don't know technically how a TV works. I'm not sure I understand enough aerodynamics that, if I had to pass a PhD level exam of aerodynamics to get on a plane, I'd never fly anywhere, right? It's just, we trust that the experts know what they're doing. And so to a denier, that looks like we're being gullible. We're sheep. We're placing the trust where it doesn't belong because we haven't been skeptical enough. Now, that's a really fascinating moment in the conversation with the science denier, because that's what makes me think they're gettable. I can get through to them because they're already skeptics. It's just that they don't understand how skepticism actually works. Skepticism doesn't mean you don't believe anything, you've done it yourself. Skepticism means that you have to have good evidence. Sometimes the best evidence is stuff that you found yourself. Sometimes it's not. And how can you tell? There have to be standards for this. You have to think. The other problem with coming back to the idea of cafeteria skepticism is that Science deniers tend to be skeptical about the things they don't want to believe. But I'm going to use the word gullible. They're gullible about the things that they do want to believe. So it's this kind of wandering, inconsistent standard of skepticism that's the problem. And sometimes I'll say to a science denier in conversation, I'm a skeptic too, but you and I are using skepticism in a different way. I mean, look, one way never to be wrong is not to believe anything. I mean, then you never have any false beliefs because you just don't believe anything. But you don't want to be that. You can't. You couldn't get out of bed in the morning, right? Likewise, you don't want to just believe everything somebody tells you. So we're all somewhere in between. And where do you draw that line? And how do you know who to trust? That's where I want to have that conversation. Because in some moments, I can out skeptic the deniers. I mean, I can say, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that person told you that, that such and such evidence, showed why you could be an anti-vaxxer? How do you know he's not lying to you? How do you know that's good evidence? At the Flat Earth Convention, they made fun of all the pictures from NASA showing a person on the moon, because they said, oh, those are photoshopped, or, before the computer, those were made in a Disney studio. Okay, so they didn't trust any photographs that came out of NASA because they were all liars. They had a t-shirt that said liars, with the NASA logo. Okay. But then they would show me a picture that, their buddy's brother-in-law had taken that you couldn't quite explain. And they'd say, well, what about that? And I'd say, how do you know you can trust him? And by the way, even if that photo is, real, maybe there's a better explanation for it than, aliens have landed or the earth is flat. Let's talk about that. Let's be skeptical, not cafeteria skeptics. Let's be skeptical about the things that deserve skepticism. I could sometimes, and when I approached it with that kind of curiosity and passion, they could get into it. Nobody tore off their lanyard and walked out to the parking lot and said what a fool I was. But I was getting through. They were listening to me. And it's because I listened to them and we found some common area. We're both skeptics. We mean something different, but I could use that.
I have to ask a question about that. Did you ask them about the chances of an entire organization like NASA pulling
Yes.
off a conspiracy like this? Unless the whole reason for NASA to exist is just to foment this conspiracy. But it almost reminds me of the some of the anti-vax people think all vaccines are a method of depopulation, right? And that every doctor in the world is in on it. It just doesn't.
How likely is it that many people could keep a secret? How likely is it that they're that competent to keep that secret and not have it leak? Look, I'll tell you the example that I used. This was 2018. I would say, part of the flat Earth conspiracy was that all world leaders were in on the conspiracy and knew that the true shape of the Earth was flat. And I would say, do you think Donald Trump could keep that secret? Really? Honestly, do you think Donald Trump could do that?
Right. He would let it out because he would want to be the one.
The one who said it.
Right.
Now, by and large, they didn't like Trump because there was a photograph of him with an Arab sheikh who had their hands on a glowing orb that they thought showed that he was in on the conspiracy of the globalists, that he knew that the Earth was flat. So I never followed that chain of reasoning out, or why Disney would be the evil person that they think he is, Walt Disney. It's kind of that there were 3 6s in his signature, which, by the way, there are 3 6s in his signature. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. So I've spoiled it for you now. You will see, if you look at Walt Disney's signature, there are 3 6s in. Does that mean that he's an agent of the devil? No. Where do they get that? But see, they think that's evidence.
I did read that in your book, but I did not look at the signature yet.
Look at the signature. It will wreck you.
Well, when you were talking about experiments and coming up with evidence, especially the flat Earth stuff, when I read from you, and I also saw that movie Behind the Curve.
Behind the Curve, yeah, Behind the Curve.
And so the flat Earth deniers, they can come up with experiments to support their beliefs, but also by the nature of the experiment, actually falsify the belief, right? So
Yes.
they come up with this experiment that if the Earth is flat, X must be true. And then they find out, oops, X is false, right? But though it's false,
Therefore, their hypothesis is wrong.
right? But
But they don't
instead,
believe that.
excuses are made, and that there must be
That's
something
right.
wrong with X. So
That's right.
did you meet anybody that had carried out that experiment or any experiments? I mean,
Yes, yes, I did speak with them, and the example you're referring to is the final scene in the documentary Behind the Curve, where the flat earthers recreate a famous experiment. This one goes, back before the founding of their organization, back, before the original flat earthers, who it's called the Bedford Level experiment, where if the earth were flat and you had three posts and you separated them from a great distance, I mean a great distance, okay? And then say you had a post and you had a little ring at the top, and then you had the second post, a ring at the top, first post, ring at the top, and then you shined a light through. If the earth is round, right, then you shouldn't be able to get the ring to, now let me get this right, the ring would go through two of them, but not the third, right? But if the earth were flat, you should be able to get it to go through all three rings. And they did the experiment. And what did they find? That it was consistent with the global earth. And you're right, they said must be something wrong with the experiment. That's not the scientific attitude, is it? If the evidence, I care about evidence. I base my beliefs on the evidence. And if the evidence tells me that I'm wrong, then I'll change my beliefs. That's why they're not scientists, because they would not change their beliefs even when they had conducted the experiment. That if it had gone their way, they would have counted it in their favor. So when it goes against them, they've got to count it against, but they didn't. In that same documentary, there were a couple of other people who had bought some kind of a scientific apparatus. I used to know the name of it.
oh,
I'm
the
not sure.
gyroscope.
Yeah, the gyroscope, right. Expensive device, the way that they had it. And they kept finding evidence that was consistent with the round earth. And then they said, don't tell anybody. Come on. That's not science. That's really bad. That's fraud.
I can imagine if you have a technical device like that gyroscope, you could say, oh, maybe I'm not using it right. But the three poles, I mean, that's pretty bare bones experiment.
But maybe you were on a hill. How do you know? How did you know it was a flat surface to put the poles on in the first place? I mean, look, you could have a big debate. They have these debates in philosophy of science about even real scientists do this too. They are going to always protect their central hypothesis and make some changes around the perimeter, right? They're the ancillary assumptions. Popper talked, and Lakatos talked about this a lot. You never actually test the hypothesis. You test the hypothesis plus your ancillary assumptions. So when you get it wrong, you say, well, one of my ancillary assumptions must have been wrong. But eventually you get enough data that you figure out, no, it's not the ancillary assumption. It's my central hypothesis. So, I mean, this is why I like Karl Popper so much, because Karl Popper is a falsificationist. I'm not a falsificationist, but he thought, just like you said, if your hypothesis is true, you should see X. You don't see X, therefore your hypothesis is wrong. I mean, that's solid logic right there. That's called the contrapositive. Yes, that is correct reasoning. So why is it that when you don't see X, you don't change your hypothesis? Bad.
If you could put it in a box or on a poster or a slide flat out, like how to talk to a science denier, so what tools to use and what to avoid, what high points would you hit there?
I would say listen. And I would say also be relentless. Right? So you have to listen, but with a smile on your face. Because you can get away with almost anything if you're calm and patient and smiling, engaging. If you're insulting, they're going to give you the bum's rush. So can I put that on a bumper sticker? In I don't know, engaged listening, empathy. There's got to be. I mean, empathy is important. a lot of science deniers are victims. Why are people climate deniers? Because the fossil fuel companies wanted them to be. Why are people anti-vaxxers? What a lot of people don't know is that a lot of the vaccine disinformation during the pandemic was created and amplified by the Russian intelligence service. Now, oh, conspiracy. No, I've got the evidence for this. This is which every conspiracy theorist says, right? They'd say, and they're living rent free in my head. But you can trace it back to the program that they had since the Russians since the 1980s to destabilize American society by undermining our trusted institutions, one of which is science. They did this for the AIDS crisis. They did, during the AIDS crisis, there was a it was called Operation Infection. I think it was called Operation Infection, and they were trying to show that they were trying to get people to believe that AIDS was invented by the United States government. And this was just a Russian disinformation campaign, but a lot of people believed it. And finally, eventually, as things were happening in the Soviet Union, some person below the presidential level, but it was high level, finally said, you guys have got to stop. We're not going to help you on anything if you don't stop this. And finally, Reagan got Gorbachev to say, okay, we'll stop. And they stopped. Well, they stopped about that, but there's a good article on this in the New York Times a few years back called Putin's Long War Against American Science. They have been feeding us disinformation about science for decades. So that is, now I don't know who's behind flat Earth, where that came from. My theory has been that disinformation is behind most science denial. I suppose that's my test, isn't it? If I'm wrong about that, I have to give up my theory. I'm still hunting to see, who's benefiting from this. Who would put that out there? Is it, nobody seems to be making any money from it. It's not politically polarizing. It doesn't seem cleanly ideologically polarizing. There are various hypotheses on this, but Russia is behind a lot of science denial about climate, about disease. They love the vaccine question, have been on the vaccine question for a long time. Very good reason, because they had a competing vaccine called the Sputnik 5. So there was an article in April 2020 in the Oriental Review, which is a Russian English language propaganda organ, which said any future vaccines developed in the West will have a tracking microchip in it, courtesy of Bill Gates, who has patent 666 on this technology. A month later, 22% of the American public believed it. That is a successful disinformation program. How many people didn't take the COVID vaccine and died because of it? We'll never know, but it's frightening.
I could counter and say, so who's profiting from flat Earth? I could say, well, maybe it could be a bet between two social scientists, right? You'll never be able to get anybody to believe this, and someone takes on the challenge.
Oh, they did that with Birds Aren't Real, didn't they? Birds Aren't Real was the one that they made up as a parody, and then they've got the T-shirts and everything. I don't know if there are any people who actually believe that. I don't know, but you brought up a point earlier. Could you, with what you've got in your pocket right now, disprove any particular science denial belief? It can be difficult, right? To just do that definitive experiment right in front of their face. I'm not sure you could do it about flat Earth.
You write about the backfire effect in your book. It's years after that came out. It wasn't replicated. People still seem to be concerned about people doubling down when confronted with contrary evidence.
Right.
That hasn't been replicated, so we can set aside the backfire effect. But let me ask you about a personal backfire effect, and this kind of, to me, relates to science denial, but I'm thinking more like doomsday cults. So when they go wrong, they double down, right?
Yes.
They made the wrong calculations, or they saved the world through their faith.
Yes.
And then one way to reinforce that is to go out and convince other people that they were right.
That's right.
So is that a personal backfire effect? And do flat earthers become more emboldened the more, I'm using them just as an example, but anybody.
Yeah, it's not a backfire effect, it's a cognitive dissonance.
So if a flat
Right,
earther, I'm sorry, if a flat earther or a science denier can convince someone else of their denial, is that reinforcing as well?
I suppose it is. I mean, look at why people go to science denial conventions. I mean, they do a lot of recruiting at the conventions because you don't want to be taking all that abuse from society in general without some allies around you. It's much easier to have an alternative belief if you've got other people believing it with you. So I think there is, some. I mean, social psychologists have known since the 50s that there is a social aspect to belief, even to empirical belief. And the definitive work on the cults was When Prophecy Fails by was it Festinger, right?
Right.
Where you I mean they double down. Why do they double down? Because of cognitive dissonance. It's too psychically threatening of their ego to admit that they were wrong. If there's one thing that defines the human species, it's nobody likes to ever admit that they were wrong. And that is, so people, I mean, the backfire effect. Let me make sure that the listeners, viewers understand the backfire effect. There were two parts of it, right? One was that you cannot change somebody's mind with empirical evidence. But the second part was not only that, but if you try, you can cause, in some cases, their beliefs to become stronger. It was that second part that was not replicated. The first part is just fine, right? The first part, that finding held up, but it's the second part, the idea that no, they're going to double down on it. And it's good news that they couldn't replicate that, because that means that you're not actually damaging things to talk to somebody about their beliefs. You're not going to make their beliefs worse. You may not change their mind, but you're not going to make their beliefs worse.
You've kind of scared me a little bit here, because when you say that they go to the convention also to try to convert others.
They do.
I can distinctly remember, it must have been 2005, I was on the treadmill watching book TV, and something went off in my head, and I just did a 180. I was very susceptible to other things, but I started to read. Things started to make sense, and all of a sudden it was like a light switch. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Started subscribing.
Wasn't YouTube, was it?
No, it was book TV, C-SPAN 2, book
okay.
TV. I was watching an author talk about his book, and he was criticizing a belief pattern, and I said, well, he just has a belief pattern. Somehow, something I worked out in my head was, I was thinking originally, well, you're just believing something, but then I started to see he's not just believing something. And that's what happened, and I can't go back. So then I've been to a few of these skeptic conferences, all right? Mm-hmm. But now you've got me wondering, well, did I just switch? So
hard to know. I mean, yeah, it does make you question your own beliefs when you take this, these ideas seriously. A friend of mine named Andy Norman has a book called Mental Immunity, in which he makes the claim that you can inoculate yourself, well, to a certain degree, against these kind of beliefs. So there's a kind of a pattern of psychic exercises. He calls it the new Socratic reasoning that you can use, and it's based on some scientific work by Sander van der Linden and Cook and Lewandowski and some other people that I've mentioned, on something called inoculation theory, pre-bunking, right? Getting there ahead of the conspiracy theorists, right? So if you wait until the conspiracy theorists say, oh, well, here's some evidence, oh my God, maybe they're right. But if you can get there instead ahead of them and say, now they're going to try to sell you this idea of so-and-so. That's a conspiracy theory. Be a little skeptical. Then when you hear it, you're kind of inoculated against it. So that, so there is a program that people can read about, and there's kind of a movement now in the disinformation sphere of scientists who are, all interested in this same idea. And full disclosure, I'm part of this. It's a group called CIRSE, the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. And we're trying to get people to take this idea seriously, that there are ways to build up your own mental immunity.
Do you have some time to talk about philosophy of science now?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This will still relate to your book, though.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm going to start to play a little devil's advocate here too. I have used myself as personal example, but this will be a little bit different. But the first sentence in the National Science Teachers Association Nature of Science statement, right? Scientific knowledge, it's simultaneously reliable, yet subject to change. Okay, so this may appear contradictory. So how do you respond to facts don't change my mind because facts are subject to change?
If you needed 100% certainty to believe, you'd never believe anything. There's a famous, so we're going to get in the weeds really quickly. But that's okay, because you asked about philosophy of science, but I've got to have something to build on. So there's something called the problem of induction from David Hume, which makes the argument that the type of reasoning that they use in science, the type of reasoning when you're talking about an empirical subject, is where you're going from the very limited piece of the world that you've sampled, and you're generalizing that to the rest of the world that you haven't sampled. So, every swan I've seen is white, therefore all swans are white. Now, have you seen every swan? No, you haven't. But you're making a leap that, every swan that I've seen is white, therefore they must all be white. Now, with that type of reasoning, is it possible that you could be wrong? Yes. But isn't it more rational to believe that all swans are white, given that every swan that you've seen is white? Yes. So that's a perfect example of that statement at the beginning of the Science Teacher's Manual. It's reliable to believe that all future swans will be white, because everyone you've seen in the past has been white. Is it possible that there is somewhere a non-white swan? Yes, because you haven't seen them all yet. You've never been to Australia, where I'm told they have black swans. So the problem of induction shows that, just what we've been talking about with science, that it's not Euclidean geometry, which is deductive logic, not inductive logic. It's, if P then Q, and P, therefore Q. You can't get out of that box. I mean, that's guaranteed. That's, that's on rails. There's only one conclusion to that argument. But with induction, it's a little bit less than that. It's probabilistic. Now, some probabilities are higher than others. And in the trade, in philosophy of science, they call this warrant. Some beliefs are better warranted than others. No belief is perfectly warranted, but wouldn't you be a fool to believe a less warranted belief over a better warranted one? Okay. There is some warrant to the idea that the coronavirus developed in a wet market in Wuhan, China. There is some warrant to the idea that the coronavirus developed in the Wuhan lab. What's the state of play between those two beliefs? Each of them have some warrant. For a long time, it seemed as if the wet market hypothesis was the one that had the higher warrant. I haven't followed this since then, but now I understand that several American intelligence agencies have concluded that it's more likely that it happened, though there's not consensus on this. So scientists sometimes find themselves in this position where you're not sure what to believe because you don't know which belief has more warrant. But once you've done enough tests, and once you know that one belief is more warranted than another, then that's the one that you should believe, while being humble enough to understand that you might be wrong. And that entire thing that I've been talking about is a way of belief called fallibilism. Fallibilism is the idea that you're justified in believing something to be true, even if you at the same time hold out the possibility that you could be wrong, and if you are, you'll change.
I want to plant just a little flag here at the lab, the virus. I understand the warrant, just so people are clear. I understand the levels of belief that it came from a wet market or it perhaps came from a lab. I just want to distinguish a lab leak is different than a genetically modified virus. That is not warranted. So just because people people hear lab leak and they don't make the distinction between level 3.
You're absolutely right. I mean, some people, because part of one reason that a lot of people didn't take the lab leak hypothesis seriously is because along with that came the hypothesis, and this was maliciously made and released on purpose.
Right, they are combined quite
and we don't have evidence that that's true. And so, but the idea that it leaked in the sense that we do have viruses in labs that are contained, and every now and then they don't follow their safety protocols well enough and something is accidentally released.
Absolutely, yes. Okay.
That's a whole different kettle of fish. But, by the way, the idea that you shouldn't take that part that I just described seriously, because most of the people who believe it also believe this other, crazy conspiracy theory, that's called the fallacy of composition, right? That's a logical fallacy in and of itself, that you dismiss this because it's part of this other thing that you think is crazy, because this other piece hived off could be something there. No, but you're absolutely right. The responsible lab leak hypothesis is that this was something that was it got out of the lab by accident. That's the idea.
You kind of answered this question, but I want to go over a little bit. Way at the beginning, and we just talked about the tentative nature of science. So I was just like you. When I went through K through 12, I was taught, look how great science is. I don't exactly recall the approach, but it was, look how great science is, look how much we've discovered. You're only taught the successes. So you kind of answered this, but so the tentative nature of science, that should also be brought into K-12 all the way up through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and the one mistake you're taught about is penicillin, which ended up being a success, right? That's the one that they'll allow into the pantheon because it had a good result. No, you should be taught about the failures. Absolutely. You should be taught about the failures. I think that the only people who think that science is perfect are people who've never done any science. Scientists understand how painstaking the work is and how often you hit a brick wall. But look, this problem of only talking about the success, that's recapitulated in scientific papers. You don't read a lot of scientific papers whose result is, and the experiment failed, but we learned something. Those papers don't tend to get published, even though they can be elegant, really useful, important papers. The one that they publish is the sexy one that finds this, finding that nobody expected, and even though it's kind of got a low p-value, it's really sexy. So let's publish that one. That's a bias. They're choosing to publish the research that only the research that shows the successful scientific experiments. They don't do a lot of work on we had a replication crisis in psychology and medicine. Why? Because they don't tend to publish studies that are replications, so nobody does them. If you're trying to make your way to tenure as a scientist, you're not going to make it by trying to replicate somebody else's studies. You want to do your own studies. So they weren't replicating enough studies, and so guess what? They found that there were a number of them that, not just because people were cheating, but maybe because they made a mistake, nobody had replicated them.
I have noticed Journal of the American Medical Association, they are publishing studies that find false results.
Yeah,
but they're
getting better.
They're giving them terrible headlines, though, because the headline will be Association of Infertility with mRNA Vaccines. And then you read it and no correlation whatsoever.
No correlation.
But they give it that headline and people
because they want you to read it. Because if they said, you don't have to worry, coffee doesn't immunize you from cancer, you'd never read it. But coffee and cancer, is there a link? Oh, you're going to read that, right? No,
but some people only read the headline. That's the problem. It's clickbaity. So when people form an identity around some information later shown to be demonstrably false, and I think you were going down the Wakefield MMR of autism. Yes. It wasn't just that he did a bad case series. He lied. I mean, I can say that because Brian Deere, an investigative journalist, uncovered. It was terrible. The falsification that he did. But
he made money off the lie too.
But it took years for this to come out. But in the
Yeah,
meantime, people formed an identity around it. All right.
that's right.
When they form an identity around something, later you can't get more demonstrably false than that, than Wakefield, right?
That's right.
They still go on with it. So what is that an identity? Is that an identity of
Look,
distrust in general, or specifically about vaccines, or?
Wakefield is a hero to the anti-vax movement, and they have anti-vax conventions at which he shows up and speaks as a victim with grievance that they didn't want me to tell you this, but. So he's a hero to this day, lost his medical license. He's a hero to this day amongst some anti-vaxxers. So I think that that is the scariest part of science denial, that it's about identity. It's not just what they believe, it's who they are. Because once a matter of belief becomes a matter of identity, then you cannot change it. Then you will not change it, no matter what the evidence. And when that's about an empirical topic that's a matter of life and death, then there's real trouble. Not only for you, but if it's a matter of inoculating people in society so that you don't have a pandemic, it can be for other people too, or climate change, where we're all literally in the same boat. It's a problem, right? So look, the real culprit are the disinformers. The real culprit are the people who profit economically, politically, ideologically from lying about scientific topics. They do it because they have an interest at stake. They victimize the people who are the deniers. Deniers are not necessarily evil people. They're victims of someone else's lie. And those lies are amplified by people in the media, by people in social media who want the sexy story or benefit from the lie somehow. And, that old quotation attributed to Mark Twain, but I'm sure it goes, or Will Rogers, whoever it is, about a lie goes halfway around the world while the truth is still getting its boots on. I don't know who said it, but it is, I think that's a true thing, especially now with the internet, where not only can you get the lie halfway around the world, but then you can find 20 other people who agree with you and make a Facebook group, and then you're in this echo chamber where you're all telling one another what you want to hear. So that's the really dangerous thing. People have formed identities around empirical beliefs, and that's because disinformation is not just to convince you that a falsehood is true, it's to erode your trust in the trustworthy people who are telling you the truth, and to consider them your enemy and to hate them. That's super dangerous. And that's my next book is called On Disinformation. And I am trying to go straight at this problem, because what I realized with my earlier book is that although I stand by the result and I think it's correct, if you want to talk to a science denier, this is how you do it. I now think that the real problem is how to keep people from becoming science deniers in the first place. And in order to do that, you have to, I think the pinch point is the amplification of disinformation. You can't stop the disinformers from creating it. Once it's out there in the world, there's a certain number of people who are just going to believe it. The pinch point is amplification. If we can figure out a way to crack down on the amplification of scientific disinformation, I think we'll do a lot better.
I have two more questions about philosophy of science here.
Yeah.
I may sort of put you on the spot here, but I'm not a philosopher, so go easy on me. All right.
Okay.
So one of the things that's come up is that science is one of the most reliable ways of knowing. And I always tag on about the natural world. Okay. But in academia, sometimes it's also followed by there are other ways of knowing. So, but they're never defined. And are you saying a way of knowing about the natural world, or just somehow in science education, science as a way of knowing is getting juxtaposed against other ways of knowing without clear definition?
Well, the lack of a clear definition is sometimes on purpose.
Okay.
Right. People before science denial, the kind that we're used to, that we're talking about here. There was a movement in the academy that went under the name the Science Wars. And this was because there were certain scholars from critical theory, from literary criticism, who had a theory that there was no such thing as truth. There could not be objective truth. That in fact, all claims of truth were merely an assertion of power. They were a form of fascism. And that, in some people's eyes, meant also about the natural world. And this started a war between the English department and the physics department, that sort of thing, where scientists were accused of being authoritarians. Don't come at me with your scientific theory telling me what's true. That's just your politics speaking. And so this caused some real friction. Okay. And so that's where some of this comes from. And by the way, some of that sometimes it was well-intentioned criticism, kind of, these claims that, well, science is not perfectly objective. Well, no, it's not. And scientists needed to own that. Some of that goes under the title postmodernism. And that is a weapon that was so powerful that, and it was mostly from folks on the left, but it was such a powerful weapon against science that in later years, once some of them had recanted, once some of them have said, oh my God, I believe that climate change is real. I'm not saying that kind of truth isn't real. No, my God, we've got to do something about a warming planet. I really didn't mean that. Well, then some right-wing authoritarian political operatives looked at that flamethrower of postmodernism on the battlefield and said, look at this. This is pretty handy. There is no truth. It's all narrative. There's no such thing as truth. Where does that sound like? Sounds like some of the things you heard come out of the Trump administration. So there, in my book, Post Truth, I talk about postmodernism and the fact that you can find the threads, and I've got the footnotes for the people who claim I'm just making this up. There are right-wing postmodernists out there who are using some of these sorts of claims. So, not that many years ago, Dick Cheney's wife wrote a book in which she was excoriating relativism on the left. This was a danger to humanity. Now there are right-wing relativists, who don't want there to be such a thing as truth, who want it to all be narrative. Some of that, by the way, fits very well with the Soviet, used to be Russian, now is Russian again, disinformation playbook. So there's more to this story. There's more to this story.
I have one final thought. I don't know if it's the final one, but something to bounce off you here. So, and you mentioned religious ideology. Now, when creationism comes up in the United States, this is something that I've struggled with, especially because I don't want to get in any trouble here.
Yeah.
But creationism gets shut down in this country. It takes a while, but if your school board gets elected with creationism, you'll get support too from the American Academy of Sciences, and there are organizations that come through and will counteract that stuff, right? It gets shut down here. But a lot of times when I hear about other ways of knowing, ill-defined, it turns out that creationism exists in other areas of the world, and it's another way of knowing that somehow is supposed to be respected in academia.
Yeah.
And but if you point that out, that, well, if creationism doesn't have any place here in the United States, it doesn't have any place in New Zealand either, not in the science department. And so it's not another way of knowing about the natural world just because we're supposed to respect. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but I mean, the danger of creationism is that, in this country, there was a movement to try to get creationism taught in the public schools, even though there was not scientific evidence in its favor. So, and they try to get people in the school board, and, in certain states, the whole history of this, back to the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s. And But after that failed, then they changed it and it became intelligent design, because then, no, it wasn't a religious view, it was a scientific view called intelligent design, except that the evidence for intelligent design was the same as the evidence for creationism. I mean, in one case, they literally have the same textbook called Of Peoples and Pandas, I think it was, and they went back and they edited it. This must have been before word processors. They edited it and they took out the word creationism and put in intelligent design, except in some cases they misspelled it and left it. So you could see it was just, or maybe it was the first computer, right? It was search and replace. So it had a very bad history. And, ultimately went, try to get people in the school boards, and it went to court and it got shut down. So, as a question of whether or not creationism should be taught in the biology classroom, I don't think the reaction against it has been ideological. I think the reaction has been, this isn't science. You wouldn't, it shouldn't be taught in the science classroom. Now, does that mean that creationism is not worth thinking about, even if it's as a prelude to seeing, even asking the question why it isn't a science, or why it, isn't trying to be a science, or shouldn't be in the biology classroom? You can talk about that. There are a group of philosophical essays, about this by Michael Ruse, which is kind of an interesting book called But Is It Science? I guess where I'm left with this is, the problem is it cuts both ways. Because, you can take this back to Darwin. People did not like Darwin in his day because they thought that it undermined, God's plan for the species. And this hurt Darwin because he was a Christian. This bothered him, or I guess his wife was more Christian than he was. I don't know how he ended up, but this bothered him. But then there are these unforeseen repercussions, right? In geology, this is a story nobody knows, but I wrote about it in my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, the story of Harlen Bretz. Harlen Bretz was a geologist who found evidence, incontrovertible evidence, for a catastrophe, a catastrophic flood that created, basically the whole landscape of the northwest part of the United States. And the geologist just came at him so angry, just with fury, because they were afraid that this was going to give aid and comfort to the Christians. This was going to give aid and comfort to the creationists, who were called catastrophists in geology, right? That no, this was a matter of slow evolution over time. Just like biology, it was the same in geology. So there's an example of how an atheistic ideology kept scientists from understanding for 30 or 40 years what the evidence that was right in front of them, because they couldn't get their head around the idea that maybe there was a catastrophic flood. Does that mean that it was Noah's flood? No. Does it mean that the Bible is true? Not necessarily. But, the ideology can cut both ways. So I don't think that ideology belongs in the science classroom. Again, but it is, I'm not trying to draw a false equivalence here, but I'm saying, I guess maybe this is the best way for me to respond. The thing that scares me the most is hubris. The thing that scares me the most is when somebody thinks that they know the answer when they don't. And when you think you know the answer without doing science, you're going to get humiliated when it's about the natural world. That's if you're a Christian, right? And you think, no, it has to be consistent with, the idea of the flood, or it has to be consistent with evolution. It can't be evolution because it's not consistent with Genesis. It can't be that we live in a heliocentric universe because it's not what the Bible says. Science is going to move on, and it's going to be to the detriment of, your ideology, right? But it can also happen that ideology can come in reaction to religious or political ideology. So that's why I'm, in favor of keeping ideology out of science. And it's why I've actually angered some people who are liberals, who have read my work and think, yeah, he's showing, the examples of science denial and reality denial that come from the right, but I put in examples that come from the left as well. And they don't always like that, and I get some criticism for that. But what I'm trying to show is that ideology and hubris has no place in science.
Great place to sum up and end there. Lee McIntyre, you have been my guest here on 502 Conversations. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this, the opportunity to converse with you and bounce some stuff around that I've been struggling with myself outside of your writing. The book is How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. And your new book again coming out, and it's still slated in August?
It's August 22nd. The new book is called On Disinformation, How to Fight for Truth and Protect Democracy.
All right, I assume it's available for pre-order on Amazon, I'll bet.
Right at this very moment.
I will go click that box. Lee McIntyre, thank you once again so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.